It was March 21st, 1960. Before the sun was even up, Robert Sobukwe was already awake in his little home in Soweto. His wife, Veronica, had water boiling on the stove so he could wash in a tin basin. He ate a quick breakfast, kissed her goodbye, and stepped out to meet a few comrades waiting outside. They walked together through the crowded streets of the township, with workers streaming past on their way to jobs they didn't choose. Robert Sobukwe broke the silence. "Boys," he said, "today we make history." When they reached the Orlando police station, the tension eased. Dozens of PAC members were already there. At about 8:20 in the morning, Sobukwe led his group inside. Calm but steady, he looked at the officer in charge and said, "We don't have passes. Go ahead, arrest us." But elsewhere, the day was already falling apart. Reports came in that some PAC supporters had been shot in the Val townships. And then, just hours later, as Sobukwe himself was being led away under arrest, the worst news of all. At Sharpeville, police had opened fire on the crowd. The official count was 69 dead, 180 wounded. Later studies showed it was more. At least 91 people killed, most of them shot in the back as they tried to run. From his jail cell in Johannesburg, Sobukwe finally heard. The police had ignored everything he had said about calm, about discipline. Instead of restraint, they answered with gunfire. And in that moment, the apartheid regime decided Robert Sobukwe was far more dangerous than Nelson Mandela. They even wrote a new law, the infamous Sobukwe Clause, designed for one purpose only, to keep him locked away long after his sentence was done. So who was Robert Sobukwe, the quiet teacher who terrified a regime built on violence and fear? Before he became the man who unsettled a government and inspired a generation, Robert Sobukwe was simply a boy from one of the most remote corners of South Africa. Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe was born on December 5, 1924 in Graaff-Reinet, a small town in the Karoo, part of what was then South Africa's Cape Province. The youngest of 6 children raised by Hubert and Angelina, his beginnings were humble, far removed from the centers of power he would one day challenge. His father Hubert, of Basotho descent, worked as a wool sorter and cut wood on the side. His mother Angelina, from the Pondo branch of the Xhosa people, earned a living as a hospital cook and cleaner. She had never learned to read or write, signing her name with a thumbprint. Hubert, by contrast, had managed 7 years of schooling before his own mother pulled him out of class to help support the family. The disappointment never left him, and he vowed that his children would receive the education he had been denied. Like most black families in South Africa at the time, their home had mud floors, no electricity, and no running water. However, it was filled with books that the older siblings brought back. 3 of the children became teachers, and one went on to become an Anglican bishop. Robert, the youngest, absorbed it all like a sponge. He began his schooling at a local mission in Graaff-Reinet, where his gifts were quickly noticed. After finishing primary school, he had to wait 2 years until his parents could afford to send him to Hildetown, the elite Methodist boarding school. For black South Africans, Hildetown was one of the few places offering a serious education, producing future leaders, ministers, and even professionals. Nelson Mandela himself had once walked its halls, and now Sobukwe would too. At Hildetown, he stood out for his sharp intellect and fluent English. Even illness could not halt his progress. A battle with tuberculosis in 1943 forced him into a hospital, but he returned determined to continue. With a government bursary and a loan from the Bantu Welfare Trust, he entered Fort Hare University in 1947, studying English, Xhosa, and Native Administration. At Fort Hare, Sobukwe's voice came into its own. He devoured poetry and drama, and when he spoke at student gatherings, he was electrifying. According to one account, at a small welcome gathering at the university residences, Sobukwe didn't play it safe. He turned to his peers and called them out, accusing them of growing too comfortable, too polished, while ordinary black South Africans were still facing daily humiliation under apartheid. This was an early glimpse of the man he was becoming. A scholar, yes, but also a voice steady, sharp, and uncompromising. When Robert Sobukwe arrived at Fort Hare in 1947, he admitted that politics was not yet at the center of his life. That quickly changed. A course in native administration exposed him to the endless regulations that governed every aspect of black life, from where people could live to where they could work. This particular subject was taught by Sisu Nhloko, a sharp and outspoken lecturer who belonged to the All-African Convention. His lectures opened Sobukwe's eyes. By 1948, the year the National Party came into power and formally introduced apartheid, Robert Sobukwe was beginning to see himself not just as a student of literature, but as a student of politics. Remember, Fort Hare was more than a university. It was a place where a generation of young Africans encountered radical ideas, forged lifelong alliances, and debated the future of the continent. Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Seretse Khama of Botswana had all passed through its halls. Now, around the same time, Robert Sobukwe launched a student paper titled Beware, which sharply criticized the government's native representative councils and called for non-collaboration with colonial structures. Sobukwe's voice carried weight among his peers. In 1949, his fellow students elected him president of the Student Representative Council. His farewell speech that October was delivered with such conviction that senior members of the African National Congress, South Africa's revolutionary party, took notice. A few months later, he was appointed National Secretary of the ANC's Youth League. That year was also a turning point in his personal life. While visiting Alice Hospital, he met a young nurse in training, Veronica. They married the following year, beginning a partnership that would sustain Sobukwe through hardship and even imprisonment. After Robert Sobukwe completed his studies at Fort Hare, he took a teaching job in Standerton, where he taught history, English, and geography. He also threw himself into local ANC branch work and, though not yet a front-rank leader, began to sharpen his political thought. Robert Sobukwe supported the Defiance Campaign of 1952, South Africa's first mass movement of civil disobedience. Here, thousands of Africans were arrested for deliberately breaking apartheid's unjust laws, including refusing to carry the hated passes. Sobukwe spoke openly in favor of the campaign and briefly lost his teaching post as a result, though he was soon reinstated. In 1954, he moved to Johannesburg to take up a post as a lecturer in African Studies at the University of the Witwatersrand. At Wits University, his students quickly nicknamed him the Professor. He continued to write, completing an honors dissertation on Xhosa riddles, but he was also writing for The Africanist, a publication that gave voice to a growing faction inside the ANC. This faction, known as the Africanists, challenged the ANC leadership for aligning too closely with communists, liberals, and Indian activists. To them, the Freedom Charter of 1955, with its ringing declaration that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, was a betrayal of the 1949 Programme of Action. To them, the ANC had betrayed the 1949 Programme of Action by abandoning its call for uncompromising African nationalism in favor of a multiracial alliance embodied in the 1955 Freedom Charter. Sobukwe believed that centuries of white rule had conditioned Africans to be submissive, while leading many white people to assume a natural right to leadership. Sobukwe did acknowledge that some Europeans genuinely sympathized with the African struggle. Yet he argued because they continued to benefit from the existing system, they could never fully identify with it. In his view, true democracy would only emerge when black South Africans themselves shaped the policies, designed the programs, and determined the methods of struggle. Sobukwe argued that they had to be free from the influence of minorities who assumed the right to think and plan on their behalf. By 1958, the Africanists had clashed openly with the ANC leadership. The following year, the split became formal with the founding of the Pan-Africanist Congress led by Robert Sobukwe. Messages of support arrived from Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Guinea's Sékou Touré, leaders of newly independent African states who shared a dream of a united continent. In his opening address at the PAC's Congress, Sobukwe made his vision clear. "We aim at government of the Africans, by the Africans, for the Africans," he said. At the same time, he rejected the charge that he was anti-white. "There's only one race to which we all belong, and that is the human race," Sobukwe was quoted as saying. It is said that balance between fierce conviction and human warmth was what set Robert Sobukwe apart. His colleagues often described him as modest, generous, and well-principled. Some of his students remembered him for his sharp humor and his ability to inspire without ego. As his biographer Benjamin Pogrund later wrote, Sobukwe's politics were born not of personal ambition, but of duty. By 1959, Sobukwe had become the face of the Africanist alternative, a leader whose words carried weight across the country and far beyond its borders. In December 1959, just days after the African National Congress unveiled its plan for a mass protest against the hated pass laws, Sobukwe's PAC announced a campaign of its own. The PAC also went on to declare that by 1963, South Africa would be free. To many outside the movement, this sounded impossibly ambitious, even reckless. Nelson Mandela later remarked that it was dangerous for any organization to promise more than it could deliver. Robert Sobukwe simply disagreed. He believed the people were ready, and he set out across the country, speaking in town halls, churches, and dusty township streets to rally support. When the ANC called for demonstrations on March 31, 1960, Sobukwe decided not to wait. His PAC would strike earlier. Sobukwe had first planned for March 7, but printing delays forced him to push the date back by 2 weeks. March 21, 1960 would be the day. On 16 March, 5 days before the march, Sobukwe had written to Major General Radamir, the police commissioner, stating plainly that the PAC's action would be non-violent and orderly. Also, just before the march, Sobukwe resigned his lectureship at the University of the Witwatersrand. All of this brings us to Monday, 21 March 1960. At home in Mofolo, Soweto, Robert Sobukwe embraced his wife Veronica, made arrangements for her safety, and walked out with a few comrades. As they moved toward the Orlando police station, men from nearby Pefeni and Dube joined in, swelling the march with quiet determination. Their mission was simple: present themselves without passbooks, accept arrest, and force the world to confront the injustice of apartheid. They also believed they could overwhelm the system itself. If thousands of people filled the jails at once, the police, courts, and prisons would grind to a halt, exposing the futility of enforcing such laws. By mid-morning of that day, Sobukwe and his companions had been detained at Orlando. But in Sharpeville, south of Johannesburg, events took a darker turn. There, some 5,000 protesters had gathered outside the local police station. They sang freedom songs and chanted slogans, refusing to carry the despised Dom Pass, the passbook every black South African was forced to carry. At about 1:15 in the afternoon, police opened fire. 69 people were killed, including 10 children, and nearly 200 were wounded. Most were shot in the back as they fled. The apartheid government claimed police officers had acted in self-defense, but journalists on the ground reported otherwise. The crowd had been unarmed. News of the killing spread fast, sparking anger across South Africa and condemnation across the world. On March 26, Chief Albert Luthuli, Nelson Mandela, and other ANC leaders publicly burned their own passbooks. 2 days later, hundreds of thousands of black South Africans responded to the call for a nationwide stay-at-home strike. Businesses closed, mines slowed, and even the Johannesburg Stock Exchange dipped as white South Africans feared the future. The apartheid regime struck back. More than 18,000 people were arrested, and on April 8, 1960, both the ANC and the PAC were banned. In the wake of Sharpeville, the apartheid state moved swiftly to crush the PAC. Its leaders were rounded up and charged. On May 4, 1960, Robert Sobukwe and 17 other PAC officials were found guilty of incitement for urging Africans to defy the pass laws. Robert Sobukwe was sentenced to 3 years in prison. True to his principles, Sobukwe refused both legal counsel and an appeal. He told the court it had no authority over him, insisting that a system built on racial domination could never deliver justice. Robert Sobukwe served his sentence in prisons near Johannesburg, first in Witbank and later Pretoria. As the end of his term drew closer, the government faced a dilemma. Releasing him risked unleashing a leader whose words had already inspired thousands to defy apartheid. Justice Minister B.J. Vorster proposed a chilling measure. Under the new General Law Amendment Act of 1963, anyone convicted under security laws could be detained again, even after serving their sentence. This provision by B.J. Vorster became infamous as the Sobukwe Clause, a law crafted for one man alone. On 3 May 1963, the day his prison term ended, officials simply extended Robert Sobukwe's detention by another year. They renewed it annually, keeping him locked away until 1969. No one else was ever held under this Sobukwe Clause. Robert Sobukwe was sent to Robben Island, but unlike other political prisoners, he was placed in a separate house, barred from speaking to anyone but his guards. He could hear fellow inmates laughing and kicking a football on the yard, but he was not allowed to join them. This isolation was meant to break him. Instead, he turned inward, pouring his energy into books and study. Robert Sobukwe completed a degree in economics through the University of London and began to work on a law qualification, convinced that knowledge was itself a weapon in the struggle for African independence. Even as the years dragged on, Sobukwe's reputation only grew. His jailers admitted as much. B.J. Vorster himself told Parliament that Robert Sobukwe was being kept behind bars not for what he had done, but for who he was. According to the government, Sobukwe was a man with a magnetic presence, an organizer who believed he had a mission to end white domination. In May 1969, Robert Sobukwe finally walked out of the prison gates, but he did not walk into freedom. Instead, the government banished him to Galeshewe, a dusty township outside Kimberley, 500 kilometers from Johannesburg. His family was allowed to join him, but he lived under a strict 12-hour house arrest. The banning order barred him from politics of any kind. Kimberley was carefully chosen because it was far from the urban centers of resistance, a place where state security could keep close watch on him. Though silenced by banning orders in Kimberley, Sobukwe's Africanist ideas lived on. They found a powerful echo in the Black consciousness movement led by Steve Biko, whose call for psychological liberation grew directly from Sobukwe's vision of African self-reliance. In this way, Sobukwe's influence reached a new generation of activists. In 1970, Robert Sobukwe was offered a teaching post at the University of Wisconsin in the United States. Washington was prepared to issue him a visa, but Pretoria refused to grant him a passport. The following year, in 1971, he tried to emigrate with his family, only to be blocked once again. The apartheid state was determined to keep him silenced inside South Africa. He could leave Kimberley only with police permission, even for family emergencies. Denied politics, Sobukwe turned to the law. Under house arrest in Kimberley, he completed his legal studies and by 1975 had opened a practice. At first, the Justice Department barred him from appearing in court, except as an accused or as a witness. After protests, the restriction was lifted, though newspapers were forbidden from quoting his arguments. Unfortunately, by 1977, his health began to decline. In July of that year, he applied for permission to seek treatment in Johannesburg, and after the intervention of journalist Benjamin Pogrond, he was finally allowed to travel in September under strict conditions. Doctors diagnosed Robert Sobukwe with lung cancer, and he was later transferred to Groote Hospital in Cape Town, where security police strictly controlled access, permitting only family to visit. His wife eventually secured permission for him to stay at the home of Bishop Pat Matolengwe during treatment, though every movement required police reporting. Despite appeals for him to be released on humanitarian grounds, the government refused. On 27 February 1978, at just 53 years old, Robert Sobukwe died at Kimberley General Hospital. The official cause was lung cancer, though some of his supporters have long suspected that delays in his treatment were deliberate. On 11 March 1978, Robert Sobukwe was laid to rest in Graaff-Reinet, the town where his journey had begun. Mangaliso Robert Sobukwe's legacy is one of principle and sacrifice. He is remembered for his uncompromising belief that Africans had to lead their own liberation. Sobukwe refused to bend even when it cost him his health and his freedom. Even his enemies recognized his power, and it was for that reason he was kept in total isolation on Robben Island, the only man held under a law written specifically for him, the Sobukwe Clause. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.